happened on Sunday night. I was taking the 11:47 p.m. Amtrak from Washington, D.C. to New York City after visiting my boyfriend. As we pulled up to the Aberdeen spot, I saw him. A man, standing outside on the platform. He stood with his back to the train, under the shadow of the station's awning. Tall, well-built. Despite the muggy July heat, he wore a long trench coat and a hat. Standing perfectly still, he stuck out like a sore thumb against the passengers hurrying off the train. Weird. I'd taken this train back from errands many times before, and rarely saw anyone get on this late, especially at a tiny stop like Aberdeen. As the doors whooshed open, I waited for him to board, but he didn't. He didn't even turn around. What's he doing out there? If not boarding. Waiting for another train, maybe? With a clank, the train started back up again. I shrugged and turned up the volume on my journey playlist. Lights flashed across the windows as we picked up speed. In the distance, the twinkling lights of a town, a highway with pairs of headlights rolling past, a colossal antenna, flashing red light at the top, grays and blacks of the ground smudged into a blur, melted into the purple sky. My eyes fluttered close. Now arriving in Wilmington, Delaware. The conductor's voice from the overhead speakers jolted me awake. I stretched, popped my earbuds out, and looked around. The train car was empty now. The two girls that were sitting near the back were gone. Yawning, I turned to the window. My blood ran cold. There he was. The man in the trench coat again, standing on the platform, several feet away from the train. I gripped the armrests, my heart pounding. No, there's no way. The Amtrak goes faster than a car. How could he get here so fast? And why? Why would he be standing at the next stop when he didn't get on board? Whoosh, the doors whooshed open. I stared at him, face pressed against the window, watching for movement. But he didn't move. He just stood there, in the shadows, back to the train. But he was closer than last time. I could see the nape of his neck, and the shadow of dark hair that poked out from under his hat. His black dress shoes shining in the light. Clack. I jumped. But it was just the doors clanking shut. The train rumbled underneath me, and then we were pulling away. The man in the station replaced with open fields of grass. I pulled out my phone. I just saw the same guy at two different train stops, Aberdeen and Wilmington, I wrote, my fingers flying across the keys. It's really weird. The three dots appeared. Then Aaron replied, What? The same guy at both? Like he drove there as the train did? Yeah. My thumbs hesitated over the keys, wondering if I should tell her how strange he was too. The trench coat, the hat, always facing away. Probably just some weirdo, I typed instead and hit send. You should have Becca meet you when you get into New York City, Aaron texted back. And call me when you're safe back home, okay? That time, I didn't go to sleep. I stayed wide awake until we hit Philadelphia. As we pulled into the station, as I saw the myriad of street lamps twinkling in the darkness, I felt waves of relief. What is it about seeing civilization, crowds, cities, that assuages our fear? It's like we're programmed to believe that nothing bad can ever happen in sight of other people, or that the mere presence of city lights, even if there's no one around, can drive the evil away. Nonetheless, when we pulled into 30th Street Station, there was no strange figure in a trench coat. I watched a few people get off the train car ahead of mine. A tall woman in a pink coat, a hipster guy wearing a knitted hat, a nerdy-looking businessman. Then the train pulled forward, and we plunged into the darkness, feeling better about the whole thing. I shot off another text to Aaron. Just past Philadelphia, He wasn't there. Oh good. I was starting to get worried. Call me when you're safe in your apartment, okay? Will do. I love you. I took the jacket off my lap, rolled it into a makeshift pillow, and leaned against the window. The darkness whipped past, and soon I was dozing off again. Now arriving in Cornwall Heights, PA, I barely opened my eyes. The station was small, a little shack attached to the platform, as the only lit structure seemed to float in the darkness, disconnected from the rest of the world. And standing there, alone on the platform, was the man in the trench coat. I jerked back. No, I whispered. It can't be. He faced the train now, but his head was cut off by the height of the window. I could only see his black shades, the buttons rising up his coat. Who the hell are you? Why are you following this train? I sat there, frozen with fear, my mind racing. The doors hissed open. This time he moved. My heart plummeted as he slowly turned towards the front of the train, face still hidden. Then he took a step. A slow, deliberate step towards the back of the car. Then another, and another. Muggy heat crept in from the doors. Sweat ran down my neck. Move, I thought desperately to the train. Please move. Please. Clank. The door shut. The train groaned into motion. Relief flooded me. It's okay. I'm okay, I repeated in my head, trying to steady my pounding heart. The train swayed as it picked up speed, racing through the darkness. I'm okay. Click. A small sound coming from behind me. I whipped around. No, he wasn't inside. He stood in the vestibule at the back of the car, facing away from me, trench coat hanging loosely from his shoulders. I jumped out of my seat, backed along the aisle. No. I turned and ran for the next car, pounded the open button. The doors whooshed open. I ran inside, glancing behind me. He was halfway down the aisle now, back still towards me. I bolted. The doors slid open into the next train car. Help, I shouted. But this car was empty too, just like the last. Can anyone hear me? Help! The lights flickered, then went out. Static crackled over the speakers. Help! Whoosh. The vestibule doors opened. He faced me. Now, his face was hidden in the shadow of his hat, but I could make out a long nose, a twisted mouth, grotesque proportions that didn't seem quite human. He took slow, heavy steps towards me. Then he stopped. What do you want? I screamed. His head canted to the side. Why are you following me? Silence. Silence stretched out between us. It felt only like minutes, but it must have been longer, because the train was soon groaning to a stop, now arriving in Trenton, New Jersey. The doors hissed open. I ran. I ran out onto the platform, shaking, crying. When I got down to the parking lot, I glanced back. The lights were back on in the train, and in the window, I saw his figure standing in the aisle. Then the train pulled away, and there was only silence. I didn't hear about the crash until the next day. The train derailed between Newark Penn Station and New York. A mangled mess of fire, metal, wire, twisted and fused to the rails. The train was empty, however. The only casualty was the conductor, and no man in a trench coat was ever found. "Mom," I yelled as I ran towards my parents' bedroom. Bloodied hands cupped in front of my chin. "What's wrong?" she exclaimed, hopping out of bed to turn the light on. "My tooth!" I shouted, blood spittling towards her. I heard my dad groan as he rolled to his other side and covered his face with the blankets. "Oh, come here, mijo. Let mama see," she said. I inched closer, both my lips curled back like a dog ready to bite. "Oh my," she said, as she held me in her arms. "Hector, wake up. This is one of his permanent teeth." That was the last time my mom held me, before she was hit by a drunk driver the next day. The doctor said she likely died before her T-bone crash stopped sliding. No pain at all. Not for her anyway. Spent the next few years raising myself and my younger brother, mama's boy. My dad was around, financially at least. He spent most of his time working construction jobs in South Dakota. He'd only spend extended periods at home during the winter months, when work was sparse. I was 15 the next time it happened. My brother Julian and I were playing Mario Kart when I felt a sharp pop in my jaw. Ow, I dropped the controller. "Hey fool, don't rage quit just 'cause you're losing," Julian laughed. "I'm not, dummy. I think my tooth just fell out." I spat the not so pearly white out into my hand and showed him. "Ugh. Get that thing away from me, it stinks." He chuckled as he leaped over the couch in faux terror. "Baby tooth, that's what I'm gonna call you from now on. Baby tooth." He never got the chance. He was caught in the crossfire of gang shooting the very next day. Collateral damage, the police said. Wrong place, wrong time. He died quickly though, they said. No pain. Not for him anyway. I lost teeth a lot quicker after that. Loved ones just as fast. Neighbors, teachers, cousins. It didn't take long to notice the correlation. I spent every waking moment tonguing my teeth one by one. My heart rate would elevate at the slightest wiggle, buckling my knees. It was a constant state of terror and dread. The dentists couldn't explain it. By their standards, I had a perfectly healthy set of gums and decently cared for my teeth. There was no reason I should be losing them at this age. They told my dad that I was probably pulling them out myself, and suggested he put me in therapy. He spent a lot more time in South Dakota after that. He even rented an apartment there for the winter. Over the years, I slowly became a recluse, too scared to talk anymore or develop any relationships. I ordered all my groceries online and had them dropped off at the doorstep. I still lived in my parents' home that my dad paid for since I never had a job. Life was misery, but at least no one else was dying. At least I was beating this curse. I hadn't spoke to another human being in years. Not till yesterday anyway. When the doorbell rang, I assumed it was the delivery driver dropping off my KFC. I waited several seconds, as I always do, then pulled the door open. 4 young girls in button-covered blue vests greeted me. "Good afternoon, mister," the one with the least buttons cheered. "Would you like to buy some cookies to help support our local troops?" I went to shut the door, but she put her foot in the jamb just before it closed. "Please, mister. We only have 10 more boxes till we hit our daily goal." I put on my most menacing looking face, shook my head. "Pretty please," she beamed. "We have Thin Mints." Thin Mints. I slammed my hand over my mouth, just as the words escaped. "Yeah, Thin Mints." She stepped into my doorway. "Please just leave," I cried as I walked backward. There was no use in staying quiet now. "We'll leave, mister, just as soon as we hit our daily goal. "Scout's honor," she winked. They were gone $50 later. The evening news said that their van drove off the side of a bridge. Brake failure. A tragedy. Quick. No pain at all. Not for them anyway. I put my teeth in a pencil case with the rest of them. My dad called moments later. I hadn't seen the number on my caller ID all year. "I'm kicking you out," he said. "I'm done with your freeloading. Go be someone else's problem." "Okay, Dad. I'm sorry." They said he fell off a roof at work this morning. Dead on impact. No pain at all. Not for him anyway. I only have one tooth left now. I can't think of anyone else in the world who cares about me, or even knows I exist. I think I'm gonna head to the bathroom and look into the mirror for a while. It'll only take a few words. It should be quick. No pain. Not for anyone else anyway. I used to work in a small nursing home. We offered our services mostly to people having dementia. Dementia, for the ones that don't know, is a brain disease in which the people gradually lose the ability to think or remember. In most cases, daily functioning is severely affected. Anyways, I had been working there for about 10 years, so I had enough experience with that kind of people. But one day, we had a new visitor. It was a man bringing in his mother, claiming that she suffered from dementia and needed help. At first, everything was normal. His mother, Meredith, was in the corner of the room looking utterly confused. Something not uncommon with people having this disease. After signing the paperwork, the son left. I took his mother and went to show her her room. She was walking nervously and fast, like she wanted to avoid someone. Upon reaching her room, she bolted in, closing the door behind her. "Meredith," I said, "open the door for me. Go away. I want some time alone." I didn't want to be intrusive to our new patient, so I thought that she'll get over it. But it was kind of weird. The way she behaved when her son left was bizarre. Bizarre for a person with dementia. I let it slide though. The next day, we gathered all the patients in the common room, as always, where they all interacted in a way or another. Because, dementia. Meredith was there too. She sat at the small table with George, a very kind man. He was at the latest stages of dementia. It's very sad for you to know that the person standing in front of you will die in less than 3 months, and you can't do anything about it. Meredith sat there, directly staring at George. She mumbled something, but I didn't hear it. I was taking care of another patient at the time, but Meredith was in my field of view. Suddenly, Meredith jumped, like she was a young kid, full of energy and desire to run onto George, knocking him on the ground. He was lucky he didn't hit his head hard. She started growling, and crushing sounds were heard. Maria and I immediately rushed over to take Meredith off George. She resisted. She, an 85-plus-year-old woman suffering from dementia. She was resisting the strength of 2 middle-aged nurses. That was truly impossible. After a lot of pulling, we managed to take her off George. Maria escorted her to her room, while I raised George. Then I noticed what happened. His thick jacket and his shirt were ripped, and the small wooden cross he was wearing was chewed up. Somehow, Meredith knew there was a cross under his 2 layers of clothing. At that time, I started getting my doubts about her having dementia. The next day, we brought her to her room again and made her sit on a small table alone. George, of course, didn't remember yesterday's incident, so we wouldn't have tension between them. Meredith sat there with a blank stare. She was creepy, not gonna lie, but we ought to help her, I thought. Meredith then started looking around like a mad person. Her head was turning, like she'd seen a fly, and wanted to copy its movement, and then she just stopped. She was continuously staring at Elizabeth, and also new patient there. She did that for 5 more minutes, and then she stood up. She threw the table to the side and started biting Elizabeth's hand viciously. Maria and I again rushed to get her. She managed to push Maria 5 meters back with her one hand. That was impossible. It was surreal. A dementia-suffering person did that. I was shocked. But Maria snapped me out of my trance, and we proceeded to push Meredith away. We did it, after some tries, but it was a bit late. Elizabeth's right wrist was chewed up to the bone. Meredith then spit something. It was Elizabeth's chaplet. She destroyed it. It had a small blue cross on it. The cross wasn't there anymore. Both Maria and I accompanied Meredith to her room. From that time on, we didn't let Meredith in the common room. We had realized at that point that Meredith's problem wasn't dementia. It was something else entirely. Mind you, I didn't believe in the supernatural back then, but I hadn't yet ruled it out of my mind. We contacted her son, David. At least we tried to. He wasn't answering. We tried multiple times, but the phone would only go to voicemail. We decided to take care of her as best as we could before David contacted us. 2 days later, it was time for Meredith's bath. We made her stand up, and we proceeded to go to the shower. We reached the doorway, but when we tried to come out of the room, Meredith held us back. Allison, another nurse, and I were trying to pull her towards the shower. She still resisted. After a couple of minutes, Allison, being a new nurse, quickly became impatient and pulled her with as much force as she could out of the room. She was successful, but before she could take another step, Meredith turned around and bit her arm. Allison fell back and started screaming in agony while Meredith ran inside like she was a professional athlete. The wall was covered in Allison's blood. She quit the day after. We didn't allow Meredith out of her room after that incident. We didn't try to bathe her again. We tried giving her food and water, but she wouldn't chew or drink anything. 2 weeks had passed, and she hadn't eaten something or drank any water. She should have been dead, but there she was, looking alive. And I say that because I didn't think she was alive at all. This woman was clearly possessed by a demon, and David still didn't answer the phone. I decided to reach out to some priests. My boss said that I was overreacting. I told her to go inside the room herself. She did. The room was freezing cold, despite the heat being turned all the way up. "That's new," I said. My boss was skeptical about this ordeal. After a lot of persuasion, she said I could bring a priest in. As I turned to walk out the door, a picture fell off the wall. I put it back up. I hadn't even turned around by the time it fell off the wall again. The glass broke. I looked at Meredith. She was staring at me and smiling. smiling at me with a creepy kind of smile. My boss told me to hang the picture back up, and that she would go get a broom. Told her it was no use, that the picture would still fall. She said, "Yeah, whatever," and proceeded to hang it herself. "See," she told me. Then the picture shot through the room and landed at the wall opposite of us. My boss ran outside terrified and told me very distinctly to immediately call the priest. The priest would come 5 days later. In the meantime, we weren't allowed to enter the room again, but I did decide to go in once. I sat beside Meredith. She started whispering. The conversation went like this. "How are you?" "Shh, my friend." "What about your friend?" "He's sleeping. You don't want to wake him up." "Oh, I'm sorry. So, what's your friend's name?" "I don't know." I tried to show some empathy to her. So I whispered and showed her affection, knowing that if she was indeed possessed, she wasn't having a great time at all. "Where's your friend? Can I meet him?" "Oh, Madison, do you believe in God?" Yeah, I do." "What about it?" "Do you worship God?" "Yes, I do." "Well, my friend isn't a friend of God's." That voice was not Meredith's. At that time, she stared at me with that blank look she always had. I stepped back. "I'm sorry, Maddie. I'm sorry that I wasn't a good father to you. But I promise I'd never forget you. And I tell you this, I love you, Maddie." I froze. This was what my father had said to me on his deathbed. How did she smiled, creepily, of course. "You woke him up, Maddie. You need to leave." I started to feel a burning sensation on my back. I started yelling, while Meredith was laughing hysterically. I left the room and closed the door behind me. The burning stopped, but the pain was still there, and it was intense. I lifted my shirt and looked in the mirror. There were 3 long scratches, starting from my left shoulder, reaching all the way down my spine. I went to Maria. I told her what happened. She saw my scratches and rushed to get bandages. 5 minutes later, she came back, and she was shocked. She said to me that the scratches were no longer there. I looked in the mirror. The scratches were gone. As sudden as they had appeared, they disappeared. 2 days later, the priest finally came. It was 2 men, an old and very experienced exorcist and a young priest. They went in the room. The old priest immediately froze. When we opened the door, Meredith's head turned very fast. As she stared at the priest, she started showing her teeth and growling, like a dog would do if it felt threatened. The priest ordered us to leave the room. In the span of 2 hours, many voices were heard from the room, 2 of which had not belonged to Meredith or the 2 priests. After the exorcism, the father told us that she was a lost cause, and the only thing that could help her was a powerful ritual that needed to be conducted that would most definitely disturb the other patients. It needed to happen daily for many weeks. It was impossible for her to come out of the room. They told us goodbye and just left. The young priest left with a blank look in his eyes. He was really terrified. I don't know what happened in that exorcism, and to be truly honest, I don't want to know. Meredith's room was closed 24/7. We would check on her sometimes, to see if she was still responsive. We didn't want to potentially have a dead body just lying in a room. The monthly payment from David didn't happen. We contacted him again and again and again, straight to voicemail. As we learned later, apparently David committed suicide. In his note, he wrote that his mom was possessed, and he just could not take anymore. He jumped off a building. 3 weeks later, I opened the door to check on Meredith. She was pale. She hadn't ate or drank anything for almost a month and a half, and she was still alive. By alive, I mean responsive. I personally don't consider her alive at all. She turned her head towards me. She then said in her normal voice, "I'm gonna meet Michael now. I'll tell him you're doing fine." She then turned her head and looked up. She passed away. It sent chills down my spine, because Michael was my father. After that, the room was empty, but you could tell that the evil was still there. I could feel it. The next patient that came, Charlotte, claimed that there was something in her room. We didn't do anything about it, and one day, I was next to her, at her bedside, feeding her. She grabbed my arm, looked at me with a terrifying look, and told me, "Meredith told me about this room. Why did you put me in here, Madison?" After that, she let go of my arm and stopped moving. The demon had taken 2 lives. My boss, after learning what had happened, chose to barricade the room. No one, under any circumstances, was allowed to step foot in there. The nursery home continued operating for another 12 years before shutting down. I left 8 years after the Meredith incident. That's at least what we called it. And we swore to each other not to talk about it again. Now I learned that someone had bought the patch of land. They want to demolish the nursing home and build something else. I don't know what it is, but I still wonder if that thing's still in there. And if it is, will it continue taking lives? Let me preface this by saying the only reason I'm still alive is pure luck. After the events that transpired several weeks ago, I'll be honest, I should be dead. Everyone else who experienced what I went through is dead, but I was lucky enough to survive. So please, pay close attention, because this could happen to you, and if you know what to expect, you'll have a much better chance of survival. I was an SR in the US Navy. I had finished boot camp and was assigned to the USS Victoria. I was told to expect a lot of traveling, but not much combat. The Victoria was small, and she was mostly used for simple tasks, like coastal patrol around South America. Boring, I know. But I couldn't complain. I worked hard to get here, and I would take whatever job they gave me with a smile. For the first few months of deployment, nothing of major interest happened. Mostly we sailed along our predetermined path, checking to make sure nothing posed a threat to the States, while also making sure the locals of nearby islands were getting into trouble. We did have a run-in with a small pirate vessel, but after a quick firefight, we returned to our normal schedule as if nothing happened. That's the life of a sailor, I guess. But in late August, something happened that will haunt me for the rest of my life. During a routine sweep of the South American coast that would normally send us in the direction of the States, a tropical storm brewed out of nowhere, and it hit us hard. Tropical storms weren't uncommon this time of year, but we still had to act fast. Huge waves were hitting our ship, and we worked frantically to make sure we didn't capsize or lose anyone overboard. After what seemed like hours, the storm eventually passed, and after muster, all hands were accounted for. We weren't out of trouble yet. The storm had blown us way off course. Along with that, the ship had sustained some damage to its engine. We were forced to dock in a port city in Barbuda to get a better understanding of what kind of situation we were in. I wasn't complaining. I was glad to be alive. And the fact we were in a beautiful tropical city didn't hurt either. I just thought of this as my official military-issued vacation. Once we docked, our engineers did a thorough check of the engines, and the crew was gathered on deck for the report. The good news was that we weren't stranded here. The damage from the storm wasn't severe, and with some hard work, the Victoria would be up and running in no time. The bad news was that in this case, in no time meant about 3 days. It could have been faster, but we didn't have the necessary parts to replace the damaged ones in the engine, and had to work with what we had, so we would be stuck here for 3 days. Some of us saw this as a nuisance. They were the ones that took their jobs more seriously than everyone else. Others were bothered at the fact that they had to spend 3 days on a tropical island working and not enjoying their time there. Those guys were mostly engineers. But for the rest of us, this was perfect. A chance to kick back and enjoy 3 days of sun and waves. Maybe flirt with some cute native girls, and overall, relax after several months at sea. The captain was surprisingly lenient on those of us that couldn't do anything. The engineers had to stay on the ship, as well as the high-ranking officers, but the rest of us were lucky. Our captain told us that as long as we kept in radio contact and didn't stray too far from the ship or the port city, that we would pretty much take it easy until the repairs were finished. For the first 2 days, we enjoyed our impromptu vacation. We hit up bars, flirted with the locals, sunbathed on the beaches, and had loads of fun. We were a little disappointed when the 3rd day rolled around, because we knew it meant that our little vacation would be over. We were completely unaware of the nightmare that we would soon be facing. On the 3rd day, we were informed that the engine repairs wouldn't be finished until late afternoon, so we had the rest of the day to enjoy the island. After discussing our options, 4 of my fellow shipmates and I decided for the last day we wanted to lounge on the beach. There was Simon, Anthony, Tobias, and Jeffrey, as well as me, all eager to soak up a bit more sun. Unfortunately, the only beach we could go to was full of people, and we wanted somewhere private. That's when Tobias spoke up. "I know somewhere we can go," he said to the rest of us. He smiled, a grin that suggested he knew a juicy secret, and we all wanted in on it. When he didn't speak after that, Simon pressed further. "Well, don't keep us all in suspense," he said, excitement lacing his voice. "What's this place you're talking about?" Tobias simply kept smiling, then turned and walked off towards the grove of trees on the opposite side of the beach. He motioned for us to follow him, which we did. Wherever this secret location was, Tobias wanted to keep it a surprise. As we walked through the forest, Tobias started talking. "Yesterday, while everyone else was off doing their own thing, I decided to explore," he said over his shoulder. "And what I found was awesome." "And what exactly did you find?" Anthony asked. "Patience, my friend. Patience," Tobias said, adding a mysterious tone to his reply. He was the youngest of us, intended to get under our skin, but I could tell he wanted this surprise to be great, and made sure not to spill too much about it. About 20 minutes of walking through the forest, we came upon a large rock wall with a cave leading into darkness. Tobias pulled out a flashlight from his bag, and everyone except me followed suit. "Are you sure this is safe?" I asked. Tobias gasped and put his hand on his chest in mock surprise. "Connor," he said sarcastically, "you're right. It's much too dangerous. Someone could trip and scrape their knee. What would we do then?" The rest of the group joined in teasing, laughing at my caution. All right, I get it," I said, annoyed. "Connor, it's fine," Tobias said. "I got through this cave to the other side and back, and I'm no worse for wear. The 5 of us together can handle it just as easy as I did. I promise you." After taking a deep breath, I relaxed, pulling out my flashlight, and followed the rest of the group into the cave. It was dark as night in there. Without the flashlight, I couldn't see any better than if I had closed my eyes. But luckily, the heavy-duty flashlights we carried with us illuminated the dark just fine. After walking for 10 more minutes, I saw a light at the end of the tunnel. As we got closer, it was easy enough to see without the flashlights, so we turned them off and stowed them in our bags. "We're almost there," Tobias said from the front of the group. "Get ready to be amazed, gentlemen." When we finally stepped out of the cave, I was stunned at what I saw. Tobias had found a secret cove on one side of the island. There was a beach surrounding a large wave pool, forming a crescent shape. There were palm trees on the right side of the pool, a rock face extending off to the left, and white, pristine sand stretching out in front of us. But the best part, there wasn't a single soul here but us. The beach was completely devoid of people. We had a tropical paradise all to ourselves. We were ecstatic, and we immediately started to enjoy the place. Tobias made us promise to clean up after ourselves before we left, which we did. We ran down the beach and set up. We had brought a cooler filled with beers and sandwich materials, some towels, and a speaker to play music. We had everything we needed to enjoy this place. And enjoy it we did. We swam in the crisp, clear water, swung from the palm trees into the ocean. We sang our favorite songs as loudly as we could. We weren't very good at it, but we didn't care. Nobody but us even knew this place existed. We had so much fun that we lost track of time, and only realized it because of Anthony. "Hey guys, it's getting kinda late," Anthony said. "Maybe we should head back." We groaned, upset at the notion of leaving our little slice of paradise, but we knew he was right. If we weren't back before it got too dark, we'd catch hell from our captain, and besides that, clouds were starting to form, hinting at another possible storm. So we grudgingly started to clean up. I walked closer to the rock face to make sure we hadn't accidentally left any litter behind, and that's when I heard it. It was soft and distant, but I could just barely make it out. "Hey guys, come here," I said to the others, motioning for them to come over. They all joined me by the rock. "Do you hear that?" I asked. They all fell silent, trying to listen for what I was talking about. "Yeah, I do," Simon finally said. "It sounds like singing." "Who is that?" We decided to investigate further. I didn't worry too much about being late. I'm sure we could have made it, after finding the source of the singing. It wasn't like we were planning on staying very long after getting our answer anyways. We walked along the rocky coastline, rounding a corner and finding the singing source. And it was not at all what we expected. Sitting on the rocks, a good 30 feet away, 5 of the most beautiful women I had ever seen in my life were singing a gentle, soothing tune. They were completely naked, but seemed to be unbothered by the rocks they were sitting on. When they noticed us, they made no attempts to cover themselves or hide. They just kept singing their song. I made eye contact with one of them, a beautiful redhead. She grinned mischievously, raised her hand, and beckoned for me to come to her, making it clear what she wanted. Now most men would jump at any opportunity like this, If most men saw a stunningly beautiful naked woman show them that they were interested in having sex, they'd either have to be stupid or in a relationship to turn them down. I was not most men. I was a sailor, a member of the military. I was trained to be vigilant, cautious of potential dangers, people, and situations. But something was causing my head to swim at that moment. I couldn't think straight. I couldn't use logic or try to figure out a reasonable approach to take. All I could think of was getting to the redhead and giving her what we both wanted. I started walking towards her, vaguely aware of my fellow sailors doing the same. But I didn't care. I only cared about the beautiful redhead and her enchanting, illustrious singing. I kept walking, my heart pounding with anticipation and excitement. Any other thoughts getting pushed farther from my mind, the closer I got to her. But then, just before I stepped within arm's reach of her, she stopped singing. They all did. My reality came crashing back down on me, like a massive tidal wave. And I regained my composure. I looked down and saw that I had unconsciously started removing my clothes. I looked around and saw my friends in the same stupor, all in similar stages of undressing. I looked back at the redhead, prepared to demand answers for what she had done to me, but I realized she was no longer focused on me. Instead, she and the other woman were looking at the end of the rock face, away from where we had come from. Then I realized something else. Although all the women had stopped singing, the beach wasn't silent. Aside from the sounds of the waves lapping against the stone, I could faintly make out another sound. It was another voice singing. But this one was different. A deep, baritone voice was singing a song similar to what the women had performed, but it was altered. The women's song was alluring and enchanting. The song I heard now was foreboding, haunting even, and it was getting closer. The women shrieked in terror, pulling my attention away from the approaching singing. I watched in disbelief as the woman in front of me changed. Fins grew on their backs, arms, and legs. Their fingers and toes became webbed, and their skin became covered in scales. Immediately after changing, the creatures that I thought were humans leaped into the water and swam hard in the opposite direction of the haunting music. I had never in my life seen any human swim as fast as they did. It was clear they weren't human. "Hey guys," Simon said quietly. "Should we be worried about what those girls were scared of?" Simon was right. The singing voice wasn't faint anymore. I could hear it clear as day. It was loud, and it shook me to my core. I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Stone cold terror. Not the kind of fear you feel when your life is in danger during a firefight. The kind that is balanced out with adrenaline. This was the fear you felt as a child, laying in your bed in the middle of the night, when you could have sworn that something made a noise in your closet, and that whatever it wasn't something you'd want to meet. I stood there, listening to whatever it was get closer and closer, until finally, I saw it. A hand reached up from the ocean, grabbing onto the ledge of the rock face, then another, and another, and another. A hulking mass pulled itself up from the ocean, and when it was up, stood still on the rocky shore, staring at us. Whatever it was, it also wasn't human, and those women were right to swim away in a panic. The creature stood about 8 feet tall. It had a humanoid frame, with mottled green skin, covered in moss and seaweed. Its long, unkempt, and water-damaged hair obstructed most of its face. It had 4 long, muscular arms, with fingers that ended in dagger-like claws. Its torso was just as massive, and its legs were extremely muscular. Having fins and what looked like 12 webbed toes. It was by far the most terrifying creature I had ever seen in my life, but just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the wind from the brewing storm picked up, blowing the creature's hair away from its face. If I wasn't frozen in place by fear, I would have screamed. The creature had no face, or at least, not in the traditional sense. It lacked eyes and a nose. Instead, 2 mouths covered the majority of its face, one on top of the other. Its upper mouth had rows upon rows of jagged razor-sharp teeth, seeming to stretch to the back of its throat. By contrast, its lower mouth had no teeth at all, and hung wide open, wider than I thought possible. It was as if its lower jaw wasn't connected to its skull, and from that gaping maw came its haunting, terrifying melody. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to turn my tail and run, and there was nothing more I wanted to do than just that. But for some reason, I couldn't. I was frozen in place, utterly terrified, but completely unable to move. I could only watch helplessly as the creature lumbered slowly towards us. It continued forward until it was standing directly in front of Tobias. Then, with its 4 powerful arms, it picked him up and bit his head off in one swift motion. Blood spurted from the ragged stump where Tobias's head once was. The monster chewed on Tobias's head with several sickening crunches, then swallowed the entire mass in one go. But the entire time, it never stopped its song. It dropped Tobias's limp body, turning and moving on to Simon, then Anthony, then Jeffrey. Each time, the creature tore off their heads, swallowing them whole, and each time, it never ceased its song. Then, it turned to me. Tears were streaming down my face as I prayed for someone to save me, for a chance to live. Then, whether it be from divine intervention or just a massive stroke of luck, I was given that chance. The rain from the coming storm had started to pour down around us, and that, combined with the wind, caused a stone about the size of a football to become dislodged from one of the larger rocks the creature and I were standing next to. It fell, bouncing once off the side of the rock, then hit the creature square in the back of the head. It wasn't large enough to kill it, or even knock it unconscious, but it did cause the creature to lose its focus and stop singing. I suddenly had control of my limbs again, and wasted no time. I ran back the way I came as fast as I could, terrified of the possibility that the creature would follow, but not daring to look back to confirm. I rounded the rock face, sprinting up the beach and towards the cave. I quickly scooped up my bag from our pile of equipment and pulled out my flashlight, clicking it on and stumbling into the cave. I didn't stop running until I got back to the Victoria. My fellow shipmates were pestering me with questions, wondering what the hell was going on. I was hyperventilating, sobbing loudly, and nearly on the verge of pissing myself. Once I managed to calm down enough to speak clearly, the captain was in front of me, demanding to know where the others were. I told them about what I saw. There was a monster on this island, and it killed them all. Of course they were skeptical at first, but after insisting that what I was saying was the truth, the captain decided to humor me. He gathered 15 other sailors and told me to lead them to where the monster was. I said I wouldn't go anywhere near that place again until we were all wearing noise-canceling headphones and armed to the teeth. Grudgingly, he obliged, and once we all had rifles, I led them back to the cave, then the beach, and finally the rock face. I was terrified of the prospect that the creature was still there. What if it started singing again? What if the headphones didn't work and it killed us all? All these thoughts ran through my head as we rounded the corner to find nothing. The rock face was completely barren. The creature and my friends were all gone. There wasn't even any blood on the stone. It must have been washed away by the rain. My captain was furious, thinking that I had brought him out here for nothing more than an elaborate prank, and demanded I tell him where the other 4 were. Despite my insistence that they had been killed by the creature, he wrote me off as delirious. He ordered 2 of his men to take me back to the ship, while the rest of them started searching for the missing sailors. Hours passed, and the entire party never found the missing sailors. What they did find were several empty beer cans at our picnic spot. The captain assumed that we had all gotten drunk and the others had fallen into the ocean. I could tell some of the crew didn't believe the story. How could 4 men all fall over a rock face at the same time? But nobody argued. After all, it made a hell of a lot more sense than what I said happened. After searching the rest of the island for any hints of the missing sailors, we finally went with our captain's story, and they were declared dead. I was confined to my quarters for the rest of the voyage, and when we were stateside, I was discharged on the count of insanity. After I was released, I moved as far away from the coast as I could. I've never gone to a beach since. Everyone believes that I had just hallucinated because of stress from the storm. Hell, even my mother thought I had been triggered because of some traumatic memory involving the ocean as a child. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still out there. Because when we were leaving Barbuda, I was sitting in my quarters, looking out a porthole. The Victoria happened to pass by the secret beach we had found, and I could have sworn I heard the faintest sound of that monster's deep, haunting tune. I used to work at a haunted house, and I'll never forget my last shift. I'd gotten the job there after I graduated high school 3 years ago. It was just supposed to be a way to make a little extra cash, but I slowly grew to love the place. The owners were incredibly nice, my coworkers were awesome, and I even managed to get a couple of phone numbers from pretty girls that went through. Although the season only lasted from late September until early November, I still gained close bonds with the people I worked with, some of whom are still good friends to this day. In my second year, I agreed to help set up the layout before we opened and got paid pretty good money for the work. I helped design the hallways connecting each exhibit, along with some of the scare rooms themselves. It was during this time that I came up with an awesome idea to get people freaked out when going from one room to the other. I noticed that there was an area that was big enough to hold an entire group, but not quite large enough to be its own room. So instead, I suggested that we create a fake stop for guests and throw in a hidden monster. I'd always been a big fan of the creature from the Black Lagoon, so I said we should design it to resemble an overgrown wooded area and use a collection of trees to hide a person dressed up as the monster and let them jump out and scare the guests. My bosses really seemed to like the idea and even offered the role of the monster to me. I said yes immediately, and I set out on getting everything I needed to make the place look great. I used dark green paint to cover the plywood sheets we'd build fake walls with and covered it with vines. I also put water in a plastic bag and covered a light with it to give off the impression of water being reflected onto the trees. Finally, I made one corner of the room to be completely covered with bushes and foliage so I could hide in it and be unseen. After we were done building, we let our owner's kids do a walkthrough. I stood still for a minute before pushing through the leaves and reaching for them. The screams I got were enough to convince me it would work perfectly. We decided that the tour guides should act like the room was meant to let groups in front get further down so not to be crowded, and right before they'd continue, I'd emerge from the growth and chase them down the hall. The first few weeks were a big hit, and everyone thought my room was the best scare. I'd get excited every time a new group would come through, and would try my best to switch up my roars and voices between each one. That year we had gotten more guests than what we were expecting, so the owners decided to extend our business hours later into the night. I was totally fine with it at first, considering we were already closing past 11. But after a few more weeks, I started to get a little too sleep deprived. I'd still give it my best with every group that came through, but it got harder and harder to stay in character each time. All this to say that by the time the season was coming to an end, I was really starting to feel the effects of the lack of sleep. There were times when I'd even start to doze off while standing in the corner, but my last night there was by far the worst in terms of exhaustion. I'd already been working on a heavy load from classes, and I knew if I didn't pace myself, it was all gonna come crashing down. I decided not to jump out during some of my groups, in the hopes that I wouldn't be as tired at the end. It was fine for the first couple of hours, just jumping out for every other group. But pretty soon, I started to notice something odd. There was a man who seemed to be taking the tour over and over again. At first, I thought my sleep deprivation had finally got to me, but after the third time I'd seen him, I knew something was off. He was wearing a dark hoodie with some kind of mask underneath it. It shouldn't have been so noticeable. A lot of people showed up in costume, but this one was uncanny. It had a torn smile across its face, with wide bloodshot eyes, staring intently forward. His pants were ripped at the knee, and his shoes were covered in mud. Every time I'd seen him in a group, I wouldn't jump out. Thinking back on it, I realized just how unsettling he was. He wouldn't talk to anyone, didn't scream when the others did as they came from the last room, and stood in the back away from the crowd. I thought about telling my boss, but right after he'd leave, another group would come in. I figured he was just a loner who likes scary places like this, and who was I to stop this guy from his fun? After his 5th consecutive walkthrough, I didn't see him for a couple of hours. I thought he'd just gotten bored and gone home. Towards the end of the night, the groups got smaller and further apart, and while waiting for them, I started to drift off again, until I heard an odd noise coming from the hallway before me. There was an emergency exit that sat in the middle of the hallway, and I saw the hooded man enter from it. It was hard to see at first, but I could tell he had something in his hands. I focused harder, and I realized it was some kind of blade. My body tensed up as he walked into the room, looking around like he was trying to find something. I held my breath as best as I could and stared straight ahead, trying not to move. He looked forward and examined the trees around me. For a moment, I thought he knew I was there, that something had given me away. I was beginning to wonder if charging him was the best thing to do, when I heard a group scream from further up the hall. He frantically backed away, and looking around before seeing a door that led to a worker's area in the back. He walked over and stepped inside, leaving a crack open in order to see outside. I knew I had to do something before the people got there, worried he might hurt someone. Slowly craning my neck and looking to my right, I could see a fire alarm they'd installed next to me. Without thinking, I quickly reached over and pulled it down. Sprinting forward and towards the hall, the alarm blared overhead and through it. I could hear the employee door open behind me. Without looking back, I ran towards the next group and screamed that there was a fire. Everyone evacuated outside through the emergency exit, and we made our way to the parking lot. We took a head count while waiting for emergency services to arrive. When they got there, I explained to a couple of cops and my bosses what had happened and who I saw. They told me to wait with the others and led a team to sweep the building. After several minutes, they came out and told us they didn't find anyone inside, but that a knife was found lying on the ground next to the employee door. They pulled me aside and took my statement, asking me about his description and if I saw anyone with him. We had to close our doors early after that, and I decided not to reapply when they emailed me the following fall. It's been a while since I've thought about what I saw that night, but something happened recently that brought it back to my mind. I was scrolling through an online marketplace when I came across a familiar mask on my feed. The account was named John Smith, and he had no profile picture, but it posted a caption along with the item for sale. Custom-made mask for sale. Designed it myself. Contact me for more details. The location listed for meet and pickup was a local grocery store just a few miles from my house. The hideous design was almost exactly how I remembered it looking, except for one thing. I don't remember seeing so much blood splatter on the cheeks. I don't know when you're gonna read this, but I can tell you when it started. I was out for a walk alone in the woods when the entity came for me. It was beyond a blur. It was, for lack of a better term, absence of meaning. Where it hid, there were no trees. Where it crept closer, there was no grass. Through the arc it leapt at me. There was no breeze of motion. There was no air at all. As it struck, I felt the distinct sensation of claws puncturing me somewhere unseen. Somewhere I'd never felt before. My hands, arms, and legs and torso seemed fine, and I wasn't bleeding. But I knew I'd been injured somehow. As I fearfully ran back home, I could feel that I was less. I was vaguely tired. It was hard to focus at times. The solution at that early stage was easy. A big cup of coffee helped me feel normal again. For a while, that subtle drain on my spirit became lost in the ebb of flow of caffeine in my system. You could say my life began that week, actually, because that's when I met Mar. She and I got along great, though, to be honest, I'm pretty sure I fell in love with her over the phone before we even met. It was almost as if the strong emotions of the first week made the entity fight back. It was still with me, latched on to some invisible part of my being. The first few incidents were minor, and I hardly worried about them. The color of a neighbor's car changed from dark blue to black one morning, and I stared at it before shaking my head and shrugging off the difference. 2 days later at work, a coworker's name changed from Fred to Dan. I carefully asked around, but everyone said his name had always been Dan. I figured I'd just been mistaken. Then, as ridiculous as this sounds, I was peeing in my bathroom at home when I suddenly found myself on a random street. I was still in my pajamas, pants down and urinating, but now in full view of a dozen people at a bus stop. Horrified, I pulled up my clothes and ran before someone called the cops. I did manage to get home, but the experience forced me to admit that I was still in danger. The entity was doing something to me, and I didn't understand how to fight back. Mar showed up that evening, but she had her own keys. "Hey," I asked her with confusion. "How'd you get a key?" She just laughed. "You're cute. Are you sure you're okay with this?" She opened the door and entered a room full of boxes. I know living together is a big step, especially when we've only been dating for 3 months. Living together. I literally just met her a week before. Thing was, my mom always called me a smart cookie for a reason. I knew when to shut my yap. Instead of causing a scene, I told her everything was fine. And then I went straight to my room and began investigating. My things were just as I had left them, with no signs of a 3-month gap of habitation. But I did find something out of the ordinary. The date. I shivered angrily as I processed the truth. The entity had eaten 3 months of my life. What the hell was I facing? What kind of creature could consume pieces of someone's soul like that? I'd missed the most exciting part of a new relationship, and I would never understand any shared stories or in jokes from that period. Something absurdly precious had been taken from me, and I was furious. That fury helped suppress the entity. I never imbibed alcohol. I drank coffee religiously. I checked the date every single time I woke up. For 3 years, I managed to live each day while observing nothing more than minor alterations. A social fact here and there, someone's job, how many kids they had, that sort of thing. The layout of nearby streets, the time my favorite television show aired, that kind of thing. Always, those changes reminded me the creature still had its claws sunk into my spirit. Not once in 3 years did I let myself zone out. One day, I grew careless. I let myself get really into the season finale of my favorite show. It was gripping. A fantastic story. Right at the height of the action, a young boy came up to my lounger and shook my arm. Surprised, I asked, "Who are you? How did you get in here?" He laughed and smiled brightly. "Silly daddy." My heart sank in my chest. I knew immediately what had happened. After a few masked questions, I discovered that he was 2 years old, and that he was my son. The agony and heartache filling my chest was nearly unbearable. Not only had I missed the birth of my son, I would never see or know the first year of his life. Mara and I had obviously gotten married and started a family in the time I lost. I had no idea what joys or pains those years contained. It was snowing outside. Holding my sudden son in my lap, I sat and watched the snowflakes fall outside. What kind of life was this going to be if slips in concentration could cost me years? I had to get help. The church had no idea what to do. The priest didn't believe me and told me I had a health issue rather than some sort of possession. The doctors didn't have any clue. Nothing showed up on all their scans and tests. They happily took my money in return for nothing. By the time I ran out of options, I decided to tell Mar. There was no way to know what this would look like from her side. What was I like when I wasn't there? Did I still take our son to school? Did I still do my job? Clearly I did, because she seemed to be none the wiser. But still I had a horrible feeling that something must have been missing in her life when I wasn't actually home inside my head. But the night I had set up a nice dinner in preparation, she arrived, but not by unlocking the front door, but by knocking on it. I answered, and found that she was in a nice dress. She was happily surprised by the setting on the table. A fancy dinner for a second date? I knew you were sweet on me. Thank the Lord, I knew when to keep my mouth shut. If I'd gone on about being married and having a son, she might have run for the hills. Instead, I took her coat and sat down for our second date. Through carefully crafted questions, I managed to deduce the truth. This really was our second date. She saw relief and happiness in me, but interpreted that as dating jitters. I was just excited to realize that the entity wasn't necessarily eating whole portions of my life. The symptoms, as I was beginning to understand them, were more like the consequences of a shattered soul. The creature had wounded me, broken me into pieces. Perhaps I was to live my life out of order, but at least I would actually get to live it. And so it went for a few years, from my perspective. While minor changes in politics or geography would happen daily, major shifts in my mental location only happened every couple months. When I found myself in a new place and time in life, I just shut up and listened, making sure to get the lay of the land before doing anything to avoid making mistakes. On the farthest flung leap yet, I met my 6-year-old grandson, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up. He said, writer. I told him that was a fine idea. Then, I was back in month 2 of my relationship with Mar, and I had the best night with her on the riverfront. When I say the best, I mean the best. Knowing how special she would become to me, I asked her to move in. I got to live through what I'd missed the first go-around, and I came to understand I was never mentally absent. I would always be there eventually. When we were moving her boxes in, she stopped for a moment, and she said she marveled my great love, as if I'd known her for a lifetime, and never once doubted she was the one. That was the first time I'd truly laughed freely and wholeheartedly, since the entity had wounded me. She was right about my love for her, but for exactly the reason she considered a silly romantic analogy. I had known her my whole life, and I had come to terms with my situation and found peace with it. It wasn't so bad to have sneak peeks at all the best parts ahead. But of course I wouldn't be writing this if it hadn't gotten worse. The entity was still with me. It had not wounded me and departed, like I'd wanted to believe. The closest I can describe my growing understanding was that the creature was burrowing deeper into my psyche, fracturing it into small pieces. Instead of months between major shifts, I began only having weeks. Once I noticed that trend, I feared my ultimate fate would be to jump between times in my life heartbeat by heartbeat, forever confused, forever lost. Only an instant in each time meant I would never be able to speak with anyone else, never be able to hold a conversation, never express or receive love. As the true depth of that fear came upon me, I sat in an older version of me and watched the snow falling outside. That was the one constant in my life. The weather didn't care who I was or what pains I had to face. Nature was always there. The falling snow was always like a little hook that kept me in a place. The pure emotional peace it brought was like a panacea on my mental wounds, and I never yet shifted while watching the pattern of falling white and thinking of the times I'd gone sledding and built a snow fort as a child. A teenager touched my arm. Grandpa. He'd startled me out of my thoughts, so I was less careful than usual. "Who are you?" He half grinned, as if not sure whether I was joking. Handing me a stack of papers, he said, "It's my first attempt at a novel. Would you read it and tell me what you think?" Ah, of course. Pursuing that dream of being a writer, I see. He burned bright red. Trying to, anyway. "Alright, run off. I'll read this right now." The words were blurry and annoyed. I looked for glasses I probably had for reading. Being old was terrible, and I wanted to leap back into a younger year. But not before I read his book. I found my glasses in a sweater pocket and began leafing through. Mar puttered in and out of the living room. Still beautiful, but I had to focus. I didn't know how much time I would have there. It seemed that we had relatives over. Was it Christmas? A pair of adults and a couple kids I didn't recognize tromped through the hallways. And I saw my son, now adult, walk by with his wife on the way out the door. As a group, the extended family began sledding outside. Finally, I finished reading the story, and I called out to my grandson. He rushed down the stairs and into the living room. "How was it?" "Well, it's terrible," I told him truthfully. "But it's terrible for all the right reasons. You're still a young man, so your characters behave like young people. But the structure of the story itself is very solid." I paused. "I didn't expect it to turn out to be a horror story." He nodded. "It's a reflection of the times. Expectations for the future are dismal. Not hopeful, like they used to be. You're far too young to be aware like that," I told him. An idea occurred to me. "If you're into horror, do you know anything about strange creatures?" "Sure. I read everything I can. I love it." Warily, I scanned the entrances to the living room. Everyone was busy outside. For the first time, I opened up to somebody in my life about what I was experiencing. In hushed tones, I told him about my fragmented consciousness. For a teenager, he took it well. "You're serious?" "Yes." He donned the determined look of a grown man accepting a quest. "I'll look into it, see what I can find. You should start writing down everything you experience. Build some data. Maybe we can map your psychic wound." "Wow. Sounds like a plan." I was surprised. That made sense. And I hadn't expected him to have a serious response. "But how will I get all the notes in one place?" "Let's come up with somewhere for you to leave them," he said, frowning with thought. "Then I'll get them, and we can trace the path you're taking through your own life. See if there's a pattern." For the first time since the situation had gotten worse, I felt hope again. "How about under the stairs? No one ever goes under there." "Sure." He turned and left the room. I peered after him. I heard him banging around near the stairs. Finally, he returned with a box, laid it on the carpet, and opened it to reveal a bursting stack of papers. He exclaimed, "Holy crap." But of course, being a teenager, he didn't really say crap. Taken aback, I blinked rapidly, forgiving his cuss because of the shock. "Did I write those?" He looked up at me with wonder. "Yeah. Or you will." You still have to write them and put them under the stairs after this." He glazed back down at the papers, then covered the box. "So you probably shouldn't see what they say. That could get weird." "That much I understand, right?" He gulped. "There are like 50 boxes under there, all filled up like this. Deciphering these will take a very long time." His tone dropped to deadly seriousness. "But I will save you, Grandpa, because I don't think anyone else can." Tears flowed down my cheeks then, and I couldn't help but sob once or twice. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd become in my shifting prison of awareness until I finally had someone who understood. Thank you. Thank you so much." And then I was young again, and at work on a random Tuesday. Once the sadness and relief faded, anger and determination replaced them. After I finished my work, I grabbed some paper and began writing. While the weeks shifted around me, while those weeks became days and then hours, I wrote every single spare moment about when and where I thought I was. I put them under the stairs out of order. My first box was actually the 13th, and my last box was actually the first. Once I had over 50 boxes written from my perspective, and once my shifting became a matter of minutes, I knew it was up to my grandson to take it from there. I put my head down and stopped looking. I couldn't stand the river of changing awareness any longer. Names and places and dates and jobs and colors and people were all wrong and different. I'd never been older. I sat watching the snowfall. A man of at least 30 that I vaguely recognized entered the room. "Come on. I think I finally figured it out." I was so frail that moving was painful. "Are you him? Are you my grandson?" "Yes." He took me to a room filled with strange equipment and sat me in a rubber chair facing a large mirror, twice the height of a man. The pattern finally revealed itself. "How long had you worked on this?" I asked him. I gasped. "Tell me you didn't miss your life, like I'm missing mine." His expression was both stone cold and furiously resolute. "It'll be worth it." He brought 2 thin metal rods close to my arm and then nodded at the mirror. "Look, this shock is carefully calibrated." The electric shock from his device was startling, but not painful. In the mirror, I saw a rapid arcing light silhouette appear above my head and shoulders. The electricity moved through the creature like a wave, briefly revealing the terrible nature of what was happening to me. A bulging, leech-like mouth was wrapped around the back of my head, coming down my eyebrows and touching each ear. And its slug-like body ran over my shoulder and into my very soul. It was a parasite, and it was feeding on my mind. My now adult grandson held my hand as I took in the horror. After a moment, he asked, "Removing this is going to hurt very badly. Are you up for this?" Fearful, I asked, "Is Mar here?" His face softened. "No, not for a few years now." I could tell from his reaction what had happened, but I didn't want it to be true. "How?" "We had this conversation a lot," he responded. "Are you sure you want to know? It never makes you feel better." Tears brimmed in my eyes. "Then I don't care if it hurts, or if I die. I don't want to stay in a time where she's not alive." He made a sympathetic noise of understanding, and then returned to his machine to hook several wires, diodes, and other bits of technology to my limbs and my forehead. While he did so, he talked. I've worked for 2 decades to figure this out. And I've had tons of help from other researchers of the occult. This parasite doesn't technically exist in our plane. It's one of the lesser spawns of our reality, and it feeds on the plexus of mind, soul, and quantum consciousness reality. When details like names and colors of objects changed, you weren't going crazy. The web of your existence was merely losing strands as the creature ate its way through you. I didn't fully understand. I looked up in confusion as he placed a circuit of electronics like a crown on my head, in the exact line of where the parasite's mouth had ringed me. He paused his work and grew pale. I forgot that you wouldn't know. You're lucky, believe me. After a deep breath, he began moving again, and he placed his finger near a few switches. Ready? This is carefully tuned to make your nervous system extremely unappetizing to the parasite, but basically it's electroshock therapy. I could see Mars smile, even though she was dead. I'd just been with her moments ago. Do it. The click of a switch echoed in my ears, and I almost laughed at how mild the electricity was. It didn't feel like anything, at least at first. Then I saw the mirror shaking, and my body within the image convulsing. Oh no. It did hurt. Nothing had ever been more painful. It was just so excruciating that my mind hadn't been able to immediately process it. As my vision shook and fire burned in every nerve in my body, I could see the reflected trembling light silhouette of the parasite on my head as it withered in agony equal to mine. It had claws, 6 clawed lizard-like limbs under its leech-like body. It cut into me in an attempt to stay latched on. The electricity made my memories flare. Mars' smile was foremost, lit brightly in front of a warm fire as the snow fell past the window behind her. The edges of that memory began lighting up, and I realized that my life was one continuous stretch of experience. It was only the awareness of it that had been fragmented by the feasting of the evil on my back. I never managed to be there for the birth of my son. I jumped around it a dozen times, but never actually lived it. For the first time, I got to hold Mars' hand and be there for her. No. That moment had shifted seamlessly into holding her hand as she lay in a hospital bed for a very different reason. Not this. God, why? It was so merciless to make me remember this. I broke down in tears as nurses entered the room. I didn't want to know. I didn't want to experience it. I'd seen all the good parts, but I hadn't wanted the worst part. The inevitable end that all would one day face. The fire in my body and in my brain surged to sheer white torture, and I screamed. My scream faded into a surprised shout as the machine and the electricity and chair faded away. Snow was no longer falling around my life. I was out in the woods on a bright summer day. Oh God. I turned to see the creature approaching me. It was the same absence of meaning. The same blank on reality. It crept forward, just like before. But this time, it hissed and turned away. I stood astounded at being young again and freed from the parasite. My grandson had actually done it. He made me an unappetizing meal, so the predator of mind and soul had moved on in search of a different snack. I returned home in a daze. And while I was sitting there processing all that had happened, the phone rang. I looked at it in awe and sadness. I knew who it was. It was Marjorie, calling for the first time. For some trivial reason, she'd admit 30 years later was just made up to talk to me. But all I could see was her lying in the hospital bed dying. It was going to end in unspeakable pain and loneliness. I would become an old man, left to sit by myself in an empty house, his soulmate gone long before him. At the end of it all, the only thing I would have left, sitting and watching the falling snow. But now, thanks to my grandson, I would also have my memories. It would be a wild ride, no matter how it ended. On a sudden impulse, I picked up the phone. With a smile, I said, "Hey, who's this?" Even though I already knew. His eyes are golden. They look like that of a toad. They shine in the darkness. That was the first thing I saw of him. 2 glowing dots shimmering in the pitch black space under my new bed. It was a large canopy bed with pink curtains. My parents and I had just moved the day before, and my dad had immediately assembled it in my room. Him and my mom had prepared the whole room for me. They had built up closets, cupboards, and a desk. All furniture was of a pleasant pastel purple color. It was the first night I would spend in this beautiful new room, and I already loved it to bits. Still, the gold dots stood out to me. So I got on all fours and crept up to the bed to look underneath it. However, my eyes were only met by utter darkness, as if the only light able to reach the space underneath the bed was this odd golden shimmer. I frowned in confusion and reached out to poke one of the dots with my finger. It felt like jelly. Ow! I gasped and backed off. Quickly, I pulled my arm out from under the bed. When I had calmed down a bit, I looked around. I was all alone in my room. Pressing myself to the floor again, I stared into the blackness. "Hello?" I stammered. "Hi." The same voice. It was deep and rugged, but not unpleasant. It sounded rather nice, actually. "Are those your eyes?" I whispered. "Yes." "Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." "It's okay. You didn't know." I hummed quietly. "You have very pretty eyes, like a toad." The voice from under the bed chuckled. "Thank you. So, I'm Mel. Who are you?" I asked, extending my hand under the bed once again for a handshake. However, instead of fingers, something warm and furry wrapped around it. It felt almost as if it was like a dog's tail. It tickled my palm a bit, and I giggled. "I'm your brother." "Are not," I puffed. "I don't have any brothers. No sisters either." "Am too. Mom and Dad just never told you about me." "Why not?" The voice from under the bed sighed. "Because they hate talking about me. So much so that they will get very angry if you ever mention me." After a short pause, he added, "We don't want that to happen, do we?" I shook my head. "So, how much older than me are you?" "I'm not sure. A couple 100 years, maybe?" I snorted. "You're lying. You can't be that old. You'd be dead." "And yet I'm here." "But Mom and Dad aren't even that old," I argued. "How can you be their son if you're older than them?" "It's complicated. I could explain, but, not in the mood for some long-winded story." I puffed my cheeks. "Fine. So what's your name?" My name? I'm afraid I don't have one. You can give me one, though, if you'd like, my brother replied. I'll call you Jasper, then. I like that name, I said. A low chuckle came in response. I think I do too. The next day, I didn't mention Jasper to my parents. Or any other day, for that matter. At first, it was because I didn't want them to get angry. However, my interactions with my older brother soon became a thing of such intimacy that I didn't even want to tell them about it at all. I would talk to him about everything, even about secrets I didn't even want to share with my mom or dad. Jasper was very understanding, always good for some advice. We became incredibly close, incredibly quickly, and soon enough, I felt like he was my only friend I actually needed. I knew he felt the same way. He would tell me how much he loved me all the time, and how much he missed me when I was at school. But my brother wasn't exactly easy care. I always had to feed him. It was difficult at first, but at least he wasn't picky. I would sneak all sorts of foods and snacks from the kitchen upstairs into my room for him. And he would eat so much. He barely ever stopped. My parents would sometimes allow me to take my meals upstairs with me, under the guise of me wanting to do homework while I ate. But after a while, they grew really tired of not having me around for dinner or lunch, so they forbade me from doing it. Jasper wasn't happy with the small portions and tiny snacks I was still able to steal for him. After the third time, I only brought him an apple. He really began to complain. Can't you get me anything more meaty? This won't do. I'm so hungry, he moaned. I'm sorry, I said truthfully. Why don't Mom and Dad ever feed you? Don't they know you need to eat? Jasper didn't respond. A short pause ensued, neither of us saying a word. I felt terrible. Suddenly he spoke up again. His voice was low and foreboding. Could you do something for me, Mel? Could you leave the window open tonight? I nodded hesitantly. Why though? No answer. Still that night, I did as he told me. I figured maybe he simply wanted some fresh air. I didn't want to upset him either. After the food I had brought him had been so disappointing. I loved my brother after all. That night, Jasper told me a goodnight story before I fell asleep. The morning after that, he was gone. I noticed when I woke up and greeted him, he wasn't answering to me. I figured he just wasn't up yet. It was Sunday, so I didn't have to go to school or anything. My parents seemed to still be asleep, so I quickly ran down into the kitchen to grab a couple slices of bread. Took them upstairs and slid them under the bed for Jasper. Instead of him immediately gobbling them down, though, they remained untouched. Jasper, I uttered. Wake up. I got you something to eat. Everything was silent. I started letting my hand travel around in the darkness, but was unable to find anything. That's when it finally sank in, that he wasn't there. I never stopped waiting for Jasper to return. Every morning, I checked under my bed, clinging on to the sliver of hope of seeing his two glowing eyes again. I would leave the window open every night, even if the cold air seeping in through them would make me shiver. Days of waiting turned into weeks. Weeks into months, and months into years, and eventually, I must have been around 13. I gave up. I left my secret brother behind, and with him all the times I had cried myself to sleep, caught a cold because of the open window, and checked the space under the bed in vain. It was around that time that I began to doubt his existence in its entirety. I figured Jasper had been nothing but an imaginary friend. A specter, a lonely child's mind had conjured up and discarded once it had grown useless. Deep down, I must have known I was merely lying to myself. But I liked this conclusion better than the alternative. Believing I had gotten rid of something with the same worth of a once beloved childhood toy was better than knowing I had been abandoned. The missing persons report and cases of people being found mauled in the surrounding neighborhood simply didn't register with me. I didn't suspect a thing when my parents suddenly started getting reluctant to let me leave the house on my own. Curfews were placed on our small town. Police, men and women, patrolling the area after dark became a common sight. I think I understood somewhere in the back of my mind that these abductions and violent attacks had reached our own neighborhood. But as I said it simply didn't register. That only changed when I was 16. I would always catch a ride with a friend of mine who went to the same high school as me. Her name was Ruth, and she was kind enough to drive by my family's place every morning to pick me up. The last time I saw her was early on a chilly day in the fall. Thick fog was rolling through the streets, covering our town with its gray, damp veil. When Ruth arrived outside, I was already standing on the porch waiting for her. Her car's red paint was shining through the fog, becoming brighter and brighter as I walked towards her. I climbed in on the passenger side and wrapped my arms around my backpack, which was resting on my lap. I exchanged a few words of greeting with Ruth before we set off. She had driven very slowly and carefully due to the fog, causing us to arrive at school about 10 minutes late. I thanked her for the ride, as always. She said it was no big deal. And then our ways parted in the main hallway. That was the last time I saw Ruth. That day, the final classes were interrupted by an alarm ringing. Our teacher turning pale and telling us to hide under our desks while she went to turn off the lights, lock the doors and windows. At first, we all thought it was just another drill, seeing as we had those a lot. But as our teacher told us in a quiet voice to remain silent, and quickly counted us to take attendance, the suspicion of something being different this time began to increase. After about 40 minutes of hiding like this, we were finally released as our teacher unlocked the door for us. Our parents had been informed already, and apparently during these 40 minutes the police had been called and searched through the building. None of us knew why though just yet. My parents picked me up from school right away. My mom explained on the car ride home. She was sitting in the back with me. Something she must have planned in advance, so she could hold me while I cried. Ruth had wandered off to the back of the school building to sneak a cigarette during the last break. When she hadn't returned to her classroom though, a teacher had sent out another student to go look for her. They found the remains of her body behind the school gym in a pool of blood. Next to her bag, a lighter and a box of smokes. This was the final straw for my mom and dad to decide to leave our hometown. We moved to a suburban neighborhood pretty far away. I had to change schools, but that wasn't too much of a bother. Ruth's death had left me frightened and sad. She had been a close friend of mine for years. I had simply wanted to get away from it all, I guess. The new place was nice. It's where I graduated. I got my first job at a gas station and my first apartment. Living on my own was great. I remember I enjoyed it from the very start. I was doing okay for myself. I was fine. Until everything changed this morning. I had the night shift at work yesterday. It ended at around 3 in the morning, which is when I headed out. The sun wasn't about to rise yet, so the streets were dark and empty. Apart from a group of 4 guys who were walking ahead of me. They looked pretty young, and all of them were wearing those jackets you'd see on members of high school sports teams. They appeared to be pretty drunk, more stumbling along the sideway than actually walking while grabbing each other by the arm from time to time to keep their balance. To be honest, I thought it looked a little funny, even though I felt bad for them. They seemed to be pretty out of it. I stayed behind them, keeping my distance. That meant I had to walk rather slowly, but that was fine. I only had to get back to my car after all. I would always pull up next to the entrance of the city's park. When the first tree came into sight, I let go of a quiet sigh of relief. I couldn't wait to get back home. The 4 drunk guys were still more or less blocking my path, but I knew it wouldn't be long now. We were about to pass the large maple tree when something dropped from the cave of thick foliage and landed on the ground, right in front of the 4 young men. At first, I didn't even understand what was happening. It was the boys' screams that tore me out of my trance. My eyes fell onto the creature that had been hiding in the maple tree. It was enormous, but with the way it pressed itself to the ground, it took me a moment to notice its full size. It was almost gliding across the street as it stalked towards the 4 youths. Its head lowered menacingly. Its black fur was gleaming in the faint light of the street lamps shining down at it from above, and its long, thin tail was whipping the ground behind it. Its mouth opened to reveal too many rows of jagged, sharp teeth, the shape of which reminded me of broken glass. It let out a low, rumbling growl, finally prompting a vocal response from the 4 guys and me. They let out screams of terror, but as my voice rose to join theirs, the shriek died down in my throat. It had been in that very moment that I saw its eyes. They glaringly stood out from the rest of the bestial black body. 2 glowing, warm, golden orbs, like the eyes of a toad. I stared at him, and Jasper stared back. He slowly proceeded towards me, but there was no menace in his gait anymore. The 4 young men stumbled apart, almost like they were making way for him, only to run off. Jasper raised to his full height. He was towering above me. If it hadn't been for his demonstration a few moments prior, I wouldn't have ever believed him to fit under my bed. Maybe he had grown since the last time I'd seen him. I felt tears form in my eyes. "It's you," I uttered, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't say a thing. It was then that I admitted to realizing what I had probably known all along. The day I had released my brother from my room. I had unleashed his hunger onto innocent people. I wondered for how long I had been carrying this feeling around in the back of my head. "Please," I began quietly, trying to keep my voice from breaking. But Jasper interrupted me. His mouth didn't open when he began to speak, but I could hear him in my head. "I'll be back for you soon." With that, he suddenly turned and dashed off into the darkness of the park, leaving me by myself as he disappeared between the trees. I was alone again, standing underneath the flickering streetlight. I wiped the tears from my eyes and slowly, with shaking steps, made my way over to my car. I drove home in complete silence, not even listening to the radio. I stayed up until daybreak. Sleep wasn't an option, now that it's night again. I admit I am very tired. I slept the day at my parents' place. I love my mother and father with all my heart, and this might be my last chance of seeing them, talking to them, tell them as much. I don't think they noticed anything off about the way that I was acting. I've always been good at hiding my fear and sadness. I'm not sure what Jasper will do when we meet again. I'm of course well aware that he might eat me. I don't really think he will. At least I hope not. Then again, I know he might not be the same as all those years ago. I want to try and convince him to stop these attacks. Maybe I could get him to move into the woods or something, so he'll feed on animals. But to be honest, most of all, I want to talk to him. If he won't be here for that, I guess I can still comfort myself with the knowledge of being able to properly feed him at least once. All this time, all I wanted to be was his little sister again, no matter how insane that wish might have been. Now that I know I'll see him again, I'm so incredibly happy. I know I shouldn't be. I know anyone that reads this will think that I'm mental, but I can't help it. I'm so happy I could die. I mean it.